We are back looking at the latest Sunday Independent Ireland Thinks poll. This is the poll for February. I'm Gabia Gatavetskeita, political correspondent with the Irish and Sunday Independent, and I'm joined by top pollster Kevin Cunningham, who was carrying out this poll late last night. So let's have a look at the state of the parties and where they are at. Fianna Fáil, no change at 24%. Sinn Féin up by 3% on 22%. Fine Gael on 20%. They're down 2%. The Social Democrats are on 8%. They're up 1%. Aontú are down 1% on 4%. Independent Ireland also on 4%. They're down 1%. Labour also on 4%. No change there. The Green Party on 3%. They're up by 1%. People Before Profit, Solidarity on 2%. There's no change. Independent and others also no change on 9%. So when I look at the state of the parties, Kevin, you were pointing this out earlier, the gap between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and I think now we're seeing the start of the new government. They have this speaking rights row that's rumbling on. They have the independents propping them up somewhat, but I think it'll be interesting to see how Simon Harris behaves as Taoiseach, how Micheál Martin behaves in a second term as Taoiseach. But really, it's going to be the two parties competing behind closed doors, and how much of that we'll see in the next couple of months will be interesting. You're making the point earlier, this is the first time in 5 years that the gap between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael is 4%.
Yeah, the Fianna Fáil minus Fine Gael gap, the fact that they're ahead of them now by 4. And I think it's interesting because in the last Parliament, I guess, when Micheál Martin was Taoiseach, Fianna Fáil continued to gain on Fine Gael. I mean, they're broadly competing amongst the same sort of voters.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of people who are essentially between those two parties, and we saw in the election a lot of people voted based on the candidates, whichever of the Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael candidate they liked the best. How is Simon Harris going to address this? Because I'm not sure if Leo Varadkar was able to address this when he became Taoiseach. Fine Gael didn't necessarily make the gains to make any of this back. How's Simon Harris going to do this while not being kind of the Taoiseach is going to be quite difficult, because obviously Micheál Martin is very skilled at being able to increase the popularity of the sport of his party when he's actually the Taoiseach. I don't know how he's going to...
Do you think we're going to see this trend continue because it's been the trend for a few polls now where Fianna Fáil is ahead of Fine Gael, and interesting, like Sinn Féin is back up slightly a little bit since the election as well. But like, I suppose, do you expect will continue? And I guess, the challenge for Harris is to really try and get ahead of that. But perhaps maybe when he's Taoiseach, that might be a little bit easier.
Yeah, well, like, I mean, being Taoiseach, he's a long time away from it, right? Because of the deal, isn't 3 years and 2 years, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that's going to be a little bit more difficult. You mentioned Sinn Féin being up 3 points. So that is actually the biggest change in this poll. Sinn Féin recovering significantly. And people might wonder, Jesus, we kind of went into the last election for years thinking Sinn Féin were going to do well, and then they didn't. So I think it's interesting because it reflects that immigration as an issue, which significantly damaged the Sinn Féin vote, seems to be continuing now in decline. It's quite significantly behind the cost of living into the fourth place spot of 19%. And you have housing on the flip side rising 8 points to 59. I think that's the kind of the dynamic here, where people are voting on the basis, people's preferences are very closely linked with the types of issues that they vote on that basis of. And then if housing is much more prominent, then,
so housing is up and Sinn Féin is up as well.
Yeah.
But unfortunately for Sinn Féin, in the general election, they weren't really able to... I mean, they did it very well, and they'll remind you, I think, every day until the cows come home, they have one more seat ahead of Fine Gael. But ultimately, their big problem is that they have no pathway to government. So they're politically irrelevant in that sense. I mean, housing is up by 8% in the poll as the top issue for people. So it still is a really big deal. But really, Sinn Féin don't seem to have any way of getting into power so they could actually do something about it.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, that was definitely the big limiting factor for Sinn Féin going in. The preference amongst the electorate for the type of government that it's got today made it very difficult for Sinn Féin to kind of eat into that kind of government formation choice itself.
I think it'll be an issue for them I think similarly like Simon Harris will have to try and maybe get the tide flowing in his direction, but also Sinn Féin have this existential crisis in some ways because they have to figure out the next time they go to the electorate what actually is their path to power, if there is one. We might have a look at the party leaders and how they're doing in terms of preference. Micheál Martin, I mean, again, the issues there are similar in some ways for Simon Harris. Micheál Martin is there. He's on 49%. He is down by 2. Holly Cairns, leader of the Social Democrats. She's still on maternity leave, of course. She's on 46%, down 1. Simon Harris, Fine Gael leader, no change on 45%. Mary Lou McDonald is on 38. She's actually up by 3, so Sinn Féin are up in the state of the parties and their leader is up as well. Ivana Bacik on 36%. She's down by 1. It's interesting that Micheál Martin is down a tiny bit, but Holly very much cementing her place there, and we've spoken about her before. And her appeal, I think, to the electorate as a leader. But I think Simon Harris is now going to have to think about how does he put a bit of excitement back into Fine Gael, and dare we say it, the words "a new energy."
Yeah, no, that's that. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure how Simon Harris is going to do it, but I mean, look, I must admit that I underestimated his ability to do it in the first time. So perhaps there is a possibility. You mentioned Holly Cairns, obviously. I think the Holly Cairns and Social Democrats are obviously up to 8, which I think is the highest for a while now for the Social Democrats. And it's interesting because Holly is obviously on maternity leave.
She solidified her place as a second favourite.
Oh yeah, and I think one of the big reasons for that is because she offers something completely different from what's there. When we asked another question of asking people whether they thought politicians were out of touch, the demographic that thought politicians was most likely to think politicians were out of touch were younger women, and which is reflected in the gender issue in the cabinet as well. But that's kind of, I think, why she has quite a lot of support, because it is quite different from everything else that's there in terms of our political system, in terms of the choices that are available to people. But yeah, Micheál Martin's still the most popular leader, and Mary Lou obviously improving her numbers, which would probably be quite good for her, because at the end of the day, I think I was surprised that there wasn't necessarily any sort of inkling about a change of leadership in Sinn Féin, because a similar result happened for an opposition party when Fine Gael did relatively poorly. I think it was the 2002 election, and Michael Noonan was gone by the weekend. So it's interesting. She's hung in there, and obviously her numbers are improving. And maybe it's the way in which the opposition has responded to this debacle about speaking, that maybe people want to see a little bit more of a fiery opposition.
Yeah, and a fight back.
Yeah.
You also asked respondents for their views on the storm, and of course we had this devastating storm that ripped through the country, Storm Éowyn. Asked respondents, when they were asked, do you think the government has performed adequately in dealing with the fallout caused by Storm Éowyn? 61% saying no. And then when they were asked, do you believe major weather events like Storm Éowyn are at least partly caused by climate change? They're saying yes, 69%. When asked about the fallout from the storm, do you think the government is as concerned about people living in rural Ireland as those in big cities? 69% saying no. And when asked, politicians, are they out of touch with the interests of ordinary people, 69% saying yes. So very much so a belief there that the government doesn't really understand ordinary people, those living beyond the pale perhaps, and that the response to the storm by the government was inadequate. I mean, we had this debate over the help that was sought from the EU Commission, where it was a bit of a delayed response, whether the government could have acted quicker on that. Now, they insisted that there was a protocol they had to go through. They flagged that they needed help, but then they had to carry out these risk assessments and so on before they could actually put in the formal offers. But it seems to be that whenever there is a disastrous weather event, Ireland, I mean, for decades has been unprepared. Whenever there's a drop of snow, the crisis nearly breaks out. I think from speaking to government sources this week, they're sort of saying now, look, we have to try and put this on a permanent footing. Like what happened this week obviously was devastating, but we have to prepare for more of those to come. And I think the public, as shown by your poll, wants that.
Yeah, it does contrast significantly. If you remember the sort of beast from the east, and the response to that would seem to be much more effective, maybe. I think, if it's fair to say that, I don't know, or at least the response, there wasn't the same sort of fallout from it. In these numbers as well, just in relation to that issue, whether they think government is as concerned about people living in rural Ireland. If you break that down by, whether someone's a city dweller or rural or small towns or large towns, those in the most rural category, that figure would rise to 78%. But still, amongst those who live in cities, 60% recognise that, in fact, the government, or at least in their perception, the government might not be as concerned with people living in rural areas. It is slightly contrasted with when we look at that kind of our politicians out of touch with the interests of ordinary people. It seems that that's not necessarily the biggest group in terms of, I mentioned earlier that it seems to be younger people, women as well, who tend to be much more likely to say that they're out of touch than this kind of rural-urban divide, although that rural-urban divide is definitely there. It just seems to be more distinctive for that group. It's also worth saying that when you look at these numbers, like you're saying, like 69%, 69%, 69%, 61%,
Really high.
or whatever. Yeah. Like I often look at these numbers, I think, right, look, if it's 50-50, then broadly speaking, government supporters are on one side, opposition supporters are on the other.
Yeah.
But when it exceeds that number, it shows that, okay, the middle ground, there's a lot of people who support the government who tend to be actually not quite happy with these sorts of things. So that's sort of like when the numbers start to get to 60 and 70% and that sort of stuff, then it's probably something for the government to worry about a little bit more.
And the poll also has some really interesting answers on how Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael supporters feel about the government's persistence to do a deal, controversial TD Michael Lowry, and also what those same supporters think about the ongoing row in the Dáil over speaking rights. You can find out the full details on the Irish Independent and the Sunday Independent this weekend.